Freedom of speech. Think about that for a second. It's one of the fundamental pillars this country was built on. It's something we take for granted every day, right? You're on Twitter. You're sharing your thoughts with your friends. You're debating ideas with strangers, sometimes shouting at each other in the comment sections. But at the core, there's this beautiful concept, this freedom that lets you speak your mind. It's one of the things that makes America. America. The ability to say, I disagree, to stand up and push back, to question authority, to voice an unpopular opinion. These are rights that people all over the world look at and dream of. But the truth is, folks, that right, that freedom, it's under pressure like never before. And it's happening right here, in the land of the free, the home of the brave. Now, I don't think I need to tell you that America is divided right now. We're seeing fractures, social tensions, cultural shifts, and on top of all that, the very thing that used to unite us, our ability to communicate, is becoming a battleground. We have this incredible thing called social media, where anyone can have a platform. But let's face it, there's a lot of noise out there. It's like we're all in this giant echo chamber, and it's easy to end up just hearing the stuff we already agree with. You scroll through your feed, and it's full of people who think just like you do, right? And that can make it hard to see the other side, to understand different perspectives. In fact, if someone disagrees too loudly, they can get shut down, kicked off platforms, or canceled. We've entered this strange world where people are afraid to speak up, afraid to share what they really think, because they don't want to face backlash, don't want to lose their job, don't want to get publicly shamed. That's a slippery slope, folks, a really dangerous path we're starting down. You know, freedom of speech isn't just some abstract concept. It's not just words on a page in the Constitution. It's the very foundation of a free society. It's the way we hold each other accountable. It's how we grow and evolve as a nation. It's how we've been able to innovate, to debate, to think critically, to challenge norms, to question authority. It's what gives us the space to figure things out, to be wrong, to learn from our mistakes. And when we start policing speech, when we start deciding which voices are acceptable and which aren't, we're walking into some really dangerous territory. It's like we're building a society where everyone has to agree, or at least pretend they do. And let me tell you, that's not freedom. That's not America. Think about this. Our founding fathers knew that freedom of speech wouldn't be easy to protect. They knew it was going to be messy, that it would mean letting people say things we might not like. They understood that giving people the freedom to speak was risky, but they also knew it was worth it. They'd seen what happened in societies where people were too afraid to speak up, too scared to challenge the status quo. They'd experienced oppression. They'd seen how power could silence people, and they wanted something different for America. That's why freedom of speech is in our Bill of Rights. It's the First Amendment. The first one, folks. That's how important it is. But now, here we are, in the 21st century, with more ways to communicate than ever before. We have the internet, social media, podcasts, platforms that let anyone, anywhere, share their voice. And it's incredible. It's revolutionary. But the irony is that at the same time, we're seeing a rise in censorship, in this cancel culture phenomenon where one wrong word, one misstep, and suddenly you're out, gone. People lose their jobs, their livelihoods, their reputations, because they dared to say something that didn't fit the mold. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't hold people accountable for their actions, but I'm saying that we need to be careful. We need to be damn careful that we're not sacrificing our freedom of speech in the name of social approval. Let's be real. We all say things we regret. We all have moments when we're wrong. And part of being free is having the room to make those mistakes, to learn, to grow. But if we create a society where people are too scared to speak up, where they're too afraid to have an opinion because they're worried about the consequences, what kind of country are we going to end up with? One where everyone's just pretending to agree, where no one's allowed to question the narrative. That's not a free society. That's control. That's fear. And it's the exact opposite of what America was meant to be. So let's ask ourselves, are we really protecting freedom of speech? Or are we letting fear and anger and this strange modern form of censorship creep in and take over? Are we defending the rights of people to express their thoughts? Or are we more interested in making sure everyone conforms, that no one rocks the boat? And folks, if we let that happen, if we let freedom of speech erode bit by bit, we're going to wake up one day and realize we've lost something precious, something we'll never get back. Because once freedom of speech is gone, it's a hell of a lot harder to fight for it again. Freedom of speech isn't just a luxury, it's a responsibility. And yeah, it's messy. It's uncomfortable sometimes. People are going to say things we don't agree with, things that might make our blood boil. But that's the price of living in a free society, of being part of a country that values individual thought, personal freedom, and open dialogue. And if we're serious about protecting our freedoms, about keeping this country a place where ideas can clash and evolve, then we need to stand up for freedom of speech. Not just the speech we agree with, but all of it. Because if we don't, if we allow ourselves to slip into this mindset where only certain ideas are acceptable, where only certain voices are allowed, then we're betraying everything America stands for. So my challenge to you, to everyone listening, is this. Don't just be passive. Don't just go along with the crowd. Think critically. Question everything. Stand up for the right of others to speak, even when you disagree. Because freedom of speech is only as strong as the people willing to defend it. And if we're going to keep America truly free, if we're going to keep this country the land of the free, then we have to be willing to defend that freedom. Every single day. All right, so here's the thing. If we're talking about freedom of speech, then we have to talk about where we are right now as a society, because we're in this strange place where we're more connected than ever before, yet somehow more divided. It's like we're all plugged into these social media platforms that have basically become these giant public squares, right? And on the one hand, it's amazing because we can share our thoughts with thousands, even millions of people. We can connect with anyone, anywhere, at any time. But here's the catch. Those same platforms, they're private companies, and they have the power to control what we say, what we see, and what ideas get out there. And that's huge. That's a level of power over speech that we've never really seen before. Think about it. Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. These companies have become so massive that they almost function like little governments, right? They get to set the rules. They get to decide what's acceptable and what isn't. And look, I get it. They have guidelines. They're trying to manage millions of users. But the reality is that they can silence voices, and they do it all the time. And we've seen it. People getting deplatformed, accounts getting shut down, content getting flagged or shadow banned, sometimes for reasons that seem, well, kind of arbitrary. And it raises the question, who gets to decide what's safe or appropriate to say? Who are these people making those calls? And are they making them in a way that's fair, that respects all viewpoints, or are they leaning in one direction? Because once you have these giant companies controlling the conversation, it's not really freedom of speech, is it? It's controlled speech, packaged up as if it's open and free. And here's the kicker. We're the ones feeding this system. Every time we post, every time we engage, every time we participate, we're adding to it. We're validating it. And listen, I'm not saying social media is inherently bad. It's a tool, like anything else. It has the power to connect us, to open up dialogue, to expose us to different ideas. But there's also a darker side, and we can't ignore it. We're in this cycle where these platforms are shaping our reality. They're shaping our thoughts, our conversations, and ultimately our freedom to express ourselves. It's a kind of soft control, but it's control nonetheless. Let's talk about cancel culture for a second. I know, I know. People throw that term around all the time, and it can sound like it's just some buzzword. But there's a real issue here. We've created this atmosphere where people are afraid to say what they think. They're worried that one wrong word, one tweet taken the wrong way, could cost them everything. And that's real, folks. It's happening to people across the board, from celebrities and politicians to regular people who just happen to say something that goes against the grain. And here's the thing. It's not just about whether or not they said something offensive or wrong. It's about the chilling effect it has on all of us. When you see someone get canceled for their views, it makes you think twice before sharing yours. It creates a culture of silence, of fear, and that's the last thing we need in a country that values free speech. Look, we don't have to agree with everyone. Hell, we're not supposed to. That's the beauty of a free society. We're meant to have differences. We're supposed to have tough conversations. But we can't have those conversations if everyone's walking on eggshells, terrified of saying the wrong thing. We're losing something fundamental when we let fear dictate what's okay to say and what isn't. And it's not just about politics or culture. It's about our humanity. It's about our ability to relate to one another, to understand each other's perspectives, to empathize. Because when we're all in our little bubbles, afraid to step out, we're losing the very thing that makes us a community, a society. And it's not just happening online. This mindset is bleeding into every part of our lives. Our schools, our workplaces, even our homes. Kids are being taught what's acceptable to think and say from such a young age, that we're in danger of raising a generation that's afraid to think critically, afraid to make mistakes. And mistakes are how we learn, right? Think about that. Every time you said something dumb when you were a kid and someone called you out, you learned from it. But if we create an environment where no one can speak freely, where everyone is so afraid of judgment, we're going to stifle that learning process. We're going to create a society that's afraid of itself. I think about the artists, the comedians, the musicians, the writers, all these people who historically have been the ones to push boundaries, to make us think, to make us question. Those are the voices we need, the voices that make us better. But now even they're afraid. They're censoring themselves, second, guessing every joke, every line, every opinion. And when we lose that creative freedom, we lose a huge part of our cultural identity. It's like we're putting ourselves in this cage, a cage we built ourselves, and now we're just standing here, looking at each other through the bars, afraid to break out. And maybe you're thinking, come on, Joe, isn't this all a bit dramatic? But is it? Ask yourself, how often do you hold back from saying something because you're worried about how it'll be received? How many times have you stopped yourself from sharing a thought because you didn't want to deal with the backlash? That's not freedom. That's fear. And it's happening to all of us in small ways every day. And if we don't take a step back, if we don't start pushing back against this culture of silence, then where does it end? What kind of society are we going to leave behind? Freedom of speech doesn't just mean the right to agree. It means the right to disagree, to challenge, to question. It means the right to think for yourself, to speak your mind, to be an individual. And that's worth fighting for. That's worth standing up for, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's messy. Because if we don't, we're going to end up in a world where everyone's too scared to speak, where everyone just goes along to get along, where true freedom, the freedom to be who you are, to say what you believe, it's just a memory. So I guess what I'm saying is this. Let's remember why freedom of speech matters. Let's remember that it's the foundation of everything we hold dear. It's what lets us grow, change, and understand each other. And yeah, it's messy. It's uncomfortable sometimes, but that's what makes it powerful. So let's defend it. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone. Because a world without free speech isn't a world any of us should want to live in.
All right. Let's dive even deeper into this. We've been talking about freedom of speech, about how essential it is to the American experience and why it's one of those rights we can't afford to take lightly. But there's something even bigger here, something that cuts across all of society, something that's actually about power, control, and the right to think for ourselves. See, at the end of the day, freedom of speech isn't just about being able to say what's on your mind. It's about the freedom to think, to question, to explore new ideas, and to develop as individuals. It's about protecting the human spirit, the drive to understand our world, to figure things out for ourselves, and not just accept whatever narrative we're fed. Think about it. When we lose the freedom to speak openly, we start losing the freedom to think openly. And that's where it gets dangerous, folks. Because if we're too afraid to even say what we believe, then what happens to our ability to think critically? We get conditioned to stay within the lines, to play it safe, to fit in, and before long, we're just accepting things as they are. We stop questioning, we stop pushing, we stop pushing boundaries, we stop evolving as individuals and as a society. And I'll tell you, that's a recipe for a stale, conformist, and ultimately weaker America. A nation that doesn't allow people to think for themselves is a nation that's on the way down. You know, there's something almost primal in humans, a need to express ourselves, to connect, to communicate our thoughts and experiences. It's part of what makes us who we are. And when that gets taken away, when we start censoring ourselves, something inside us withers. That fire, that drive to understand, to learn, to speak, it dimes. And you can feel it. And you can feel it. Look around. How many people do you see these days who seem like they're just going through the motions, afraid to ruffle feathers, just trying to stay under the radar? There's this sense that we're all on edge, like we're waiting for someone to call us out, to accuse us of thinking the wrong thoughts. That's not freedom. That's self-imposed censorship, a kind of mental cage, and it's draining, it's exhausting, and it's eroding our spirit. Now, here's the thing we don't talk about enough. When we suppress freedom of speech, we're also suppressing progress. Every major leap forward, scientifically, culturally, politically, came from people who weren't afraid to challenge the status quo, to question what everyone else thought was true. The Wright brothers, Rosa Parks, Albert Einstein, Martin Luther King Jr., these are people who rocked the boat, who weren't afraid to stand up and say, I see things differently. And because of them, the world changed. Progress depends on those voices, on the rebels, the innovators, the misfits. But if we live in a world where everyone's too scared to speak up, too worried about the consequences of saying something unpopular, then how are we going to make any meaningful progress? We're not. We're going to stagnate. And here's the irony, folks. We're living in a time where people claim they're fighting for a better, more inclusive society. We're hearing all about diversity, about embracing different cultures, backgrounds, and perspectives. But true diversity isn't just about the surface stuff. It's not just about race or gender or where you're from. True diversity is diversity of thought. It's about creating a culture where people can come together and share their different ideas, their perspectives, without fear of being silenced. But right now, we're missing that. We're in danger of building a society that only wants diversity in appearance, but not diversity in thinking. And that's a serious problem, because if we're all just saying the same things, thinking the same things, agreeing with the same narratives, we're not really diverse. We're just a collective echo chamber. Let's be honest. This whole issue with free speech, it's not just about words. It's about who gets to control the narrative, and whoever controls the narrative has the power. If you can control what people say, you can control what they think, and that's a power that historically has led to some dark places. You look at authoritarian regimes throughout history, and it always starts the same way. First, they limit speech. They start shutting down the voices they don't like, the voices that challenge them. They say it's for the greater good. They say it's to protect the people, to keep society safe. But it's always about control. And once they've taken control over speech, they start shaping what's true and what's false. It's a slippery slope, folks. And if you think it can't happen here, just take a look at what's already happening. Look at the people who are afraid to voice their opinions, who are backing down from conversations, who are censoring themselves. Freedom of speech isn't just about protecting one person's right to say whatever they want. It's about protecting all of us from losing control over our own minds. Because when you can't speak freely, you start thinking less freely. You start adapting, adjusting, playing it safe. And that's a dangerous place for any society. It's how we end up in a world where everyone's just parroting the same safe, acceptable ideas, where no one's willing to challenge anything, where the status quo is all that exists. And I don't know about you, but that's not the America I believe in. America was built on bold ideas, on brave people who were willing to stand up and say, this is what I believe, and I'm not backing down. We have to keep that spirit alive. So here's my challenge to you, to everyone listening. Don't let fear dictate your thoughts. Don't let the pressure to conform, to fit in, to be acceptable, stop you from speaking your truth, because if enough of us stay quiet, if we all keep our heads down and just go along to get along, then we're going to lose something priceless. And it's not just our freedom of speech we'll lose. It's our freedom to be who we are, to think as individuals, to connect as a community that values every voice, every perspective. That's the America we need to fight for. And it starts with each of us standing up, speaking up, and remembering that real freedom isn't always comfortable. It's challenging, it's messy, it's often uncomfortable, but it's worth it. It's the only way we keep pushing forward, the only way we keep this great experiment we call America alive. And that's a fight I think is worth fighting for every single day. All right? So let's bring this home. I know we've talked a lot about freedom of speech, about what it means, why it matters, and what happens when it's at risk. But I think what really needs to sink in, what we all need to understand on a deep level, is that this isn't just some abstract, high-level debate. This isn't just a problem for politicians or the media or some intellectual crowd. This is personal. This is about each one of us and the kind of country we want to live in. It's about our daily lives, our relationships, our communities, and the way we interact with each other every single day. Freedom of speech is woven into the fabric of who we are as Americans. It's a right we exercise constantly, sometimes without even realizing it. Every time we share an idea, every time we post a thought online, every time we stand up for what we believe in, even if it's just a casual conversation with a friend or a stranger. And if we let this freedom slip away, if we stop fighting for it, it changes everything. It changes us. You know, there's this idea that's been floated around lately that maybe we don't need total freedom of speech, that maybe some ideas are just too dangerous, that maybe some words or viewpoints should be off limits because they're too risky or they might hurt people. And look, I'm not saying we should go out there and encourage hateful speech or that we shouldn't care about the impact of our words. Of course we should. Words have power, but I also believe that the best way to counter bad ideas, dangerous ideas, isn't by shutting them down. It's by exposing them, by putting them in the light and letting people see them for what they are. Because when we start deciding which ideas are allowed and which aren't, we start down a road where we're no longer the ones in control of our thoughts. We give that control to someone else, and we all know that power given away is rarely given back. Think about it this way. America isn't a perfect country. It never has been, and it probably never will be. But that's not the point. The point is that we're always striving to be better, to grow, to learn, to push ourselves as a nation, and freedom of speech has been central to that journey. It's the engine of progress. Without it, how do we have those tough conversations that lead to change? How do we challenge each other? How do we push boundaries? Without the freedom to say what we believe, we're just stuck, spinning in place, avoiding every difficult subject.
And that's the irony, isn't it? Because a lot of the time, the people who are calling for more restrictions on speech, They say they're doing it to make society better.
They want to make things more just, more fair, more inclusive.
Right.
But if we're not free to speak openly, if we're not free to make mistakes, to learn, to question, then we're never really going to make that progress they say they want. And let's talk about the role of discomfort here, because I think that's something people try to avoid way too much these days. Discomfort, folks, is part of the deal. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. Evolution, real change, it happens when we're forced to confront things that make us uncomfortable, things that challenge our beliefs, things that force us to rethink what we thought was true. That's the beauty of freedom of speech. It puts us in situations where we have to listen to things that might make our skin crawl or might make us question ourselves. And yeah, it's tough. It's uncomfortable, but it's absolutely necessary. If we shield ourselves from every idea that we find offensive or disagreeable, we're never going to grow. We're just going to sit in our little echo chambers surrounded by people who think exactly like we do, and that's not a recipe for a strong society. That's how societies weaken. That's how they become fragile, how they lose their edge, their vitality. Look at history. The biggest breakthroughs, the biggest changes, the moments that really shaped our world, none of them happened because people were comfortable. They happened because people were willing to challenge the norms, to put themselves on the line, to risk their reputations, sometimes even their lives, for the truth. And today, even though we're not facing the same struggles as those who came before us, we're still facing our own battles. And one of the biggest battles right now is the battle for the right to think, to speak, to express ourselves without fear. We owe it to those who fought for this freedom to keep fighting, to keep pushing for open dialogue, to stay brave in the face of pressure to conform. So here's my message to you. Don't be afraid to think for yourself. Don't be afraid to stand up and say what you believe, even if it's unpopular, even if it's controversial, even if it makes people uncomfortable. Don't be afraid to defend your right and the rights of others to speak freely. Because, folks, freedom of speech isn't just a right we exercise for ourselves. It's something we defend for the future, for the generations that come after us. We have a responsibility here. Responsibility to keep this freedom alive, to make sure it's still here for our kids and their kids. Because if we give it up, if we let it go, they're the ones who are going to have to fight to get it back. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather not leave that burden to them. So the next time you're faced with an idea that challenges you, that makes you uncomfortable, lean into it. Listen to it. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to adopt it, but you do have to respect the right of others to express it, because that's how we build resilience. That's how we build a society that's strong enough to handle diversity. Not just in appearance, but in thought. And in the end, that's what America is all about. It's about the clash of ideas, the freedom to be yourself, to speak your mind, to live without fear of repression. And if we're going to keep that dream alive, if we're going to keep this country truly free, then we need to be brave enough to defend that, right? Every day, in every conversation, in every space, online or offline. Because a free society isn't a gift, it's a commitment. It's something we build together, something we protect together every day. So let's not be afraid to do the work to defend that freedom and to keep the spirit of open, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable dialogue alive. All right, folks, as we wrap this up, I want us to take a moment and really think about where we are as a country and what it means to live in a world where freedom of speech is a core value. Because this isn't just some high-minded philosophical debate. It's real life. It's about who we are as Americans, who we are as human beings, and what we're willing to stand up for, even when it's difficult. Think about it. Freedom of speech is about so much more than just the right to say what's on your mind. It's about the freedom to think, to question, to challenge. It's about keeping the doors open to new ideas, to dialogue, to change. And right now, those doors are slowly being pushed shut, bit by bit, inch by inch. We're losing the space to truly express ourselves. And that should wake us up. That should make us stop and ask ourselves, what are we doing? See, freedom of speech isn't just nice to have right. It's the foundation of everything else. It's what allows us to be individuals, to be creative, to be human. Because when you can speak freely, you can think freely, you're not confined to one narrow way of seeing the world. You're open, you're curious, you're able to explore. And when we start censoring ourselves or letting others dictate what's safe or acceptable to say, we're not just losing words, we're losing ideas. We're losing possibilities. We're putting limits on our potential, on our growth, on the kind of society we can become. And folks, that's a dangerous place to be, because history shows us when a society stops valuing freedom of speech, it stops progressing. It starts to stagnate. It becomes rigid, fearful, closed off. It's a society that's more interested in controlling people than in empowering them. So what does it look like to really live in a free society? It looks like people having hard conversations. It looks like people disagreeing, sometimes passionately, sometimes uncomfortably. It looks like people testing the boundaries, pushing back, and challenging each other. And yeah, messy. It's chaotic. But that's the beauty of it, because through that chaos, we get something real. We get society that's resilient, that's dynamic, that's capable of handling all kinds of ideas, of perspectives, of people. We get a society that isn't afraid of differences, but is stronger because of them. And we're in danger of losing that. We're in danger of creating a society where people are too afraid to speak up, where they're so worried about being canceled or criticized or misjudged that they'd rather stay silent. But silence isn't the answer. Silence doesn't lead to understanding. Silence doesn't build bridges. Silence is the opposite of growth. It's a dead end. And look, I get that not every conversation is easy. I know there are things that are tough to talk about, issues that make us uncomfortable, that force us to confront things we might rather avoid. But that's exactly why we need freedom of speech. Because if we can't talk about the tough stuff, if we can't face the hard truths, then we're not really living in a free society. We're living in a controlled society, society that's more interested in keeping the peace than in seeking the truth. And the truth, folks, isn't always comfortable. It's not always easy, but it's necessary. It's the only way we learn, the only way we grow, the only way we get closer to understanding one another. So here's what I want each of us to think about. What kind of future do we want? Do we want a future where everyone's afraid to speak, where everyone's afraid to speak, where every word has to be carefully curated to avoid offending someone, where people just go along to get along? Or do we want a future where people can be real, where they can be honest, where they can be themselves? Because that's what freedom of speech gives us, the freedom to be who we are. Not some watered down, edited version, but our true, unfiltered selves. And I believe that's worth fighting for. I believe that's worth standing up for, even when it's uncomfortable. Even when it's uncomfortable, even when it means defending the rights of people we disagree with, people who might say things we don't like, because freedom of speech isn't about protecting what's popular. It's about protecting what's real. Mm-hmm. And sometimes what's real is messy. Sometimes it's controversial, but it's always worth it. So as we move forward, let's keep that in mind. Let's remember that freedom of speech isn't just a right we have on paper. It's a right we have to live every day, in every conversation, in every decision we make. It's something we have to fight for, to stand up for, to protect, not just for ourselves, but for each other, for the future. And let's remember that this freedom isn't free. It comes with responsibility. It comes with a commitment to engage, to listen, to learn, to be open to ideas that challenge us. And if we do that, if we keep that spirit alive, then freedom of speech will continue to be the powerful, transformative force it's always been. So let's be brave, folks. Let's keep talking, keep challenging, keep questioning. Let's be the kind of people who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's unpopular. Let's be the ones who keep freedom of speech alive, not just as a right, but as a way of life. Because in the end, that's what makes us truly free. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us American. All right, let's bring this to a close. But before we finish, I want us all to think about what freedom of speech actually means right now, in this moment. I want you to think about the choices we're making, the world we're shaping, and the legacy we're leaving, because we have to understand that freedom of speech is something fragile. It's something that can be lost, something that can be chipped away little by little until it's gone. And the most dangerous part is that this doesn't usually happen in some dramatic, sweeping way. You know, it happens in small, quiet steps. It happens when we let things slide, when we stop speaking up, when we look the other way. It happens when we let fear take over, fear of judgment, fear of being wrong, fear of standing out. But folks, we can't let that happen, because if we lose the freedom to speak, we lose the freedom to think, to question, to be our true selves. Think about it. Imagine a world where everyone is just nodding along, afraid to rock the boat, afraid to say what they really believe, afraid to say what they really believe. It sounds crazy, but that's exactly where we're headed if we don't stand up. If we don't start defending the right to speak, even the speech we disagree with, the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, then we're on a fast track to a world where everything is censored, where everything is filtered, where our lives are painted in these shades of safe, approved gray. And that's not living. That's existing. That's a world stripped of passion, stripped of creativity, stripped of authenticity. And if there's one thing I know about America, it's that we're not meant to live in shades of gray. We're a nation of bold colors, of loud voices, of brave souls who built a place where people could be themselves without fear. And we owe it to ourselves, to the generations that came before us, and to those that will come after, to keep that spirit alive. Now, I wanted to address something I hear all the time. This idea that freedom of speech is dangerous, that it's somehow a risk to society. And look, let's be real. Words have power. Ideas have power. But that's exactly why we need freedom of speech. If words can change the world, and they can, then we need to hear all of them, not just the ones that are polished and approved. We need to hear the rough edges, the uncomfortable truths, the challenges to our beliefs. Because only then do we get the full picture. Only then do we grow. Do we expand? Do we push ourselves to understand things beyond our own experience? Freedom of speech isn't dangerous. It's essential. It's what keeps us questioning, exploring, learning. And yeah, sometimes that means we're going to hear things we don't like, things that make us angry, things that make us question who we are. But that's okay. That's the cost of living in a free society. That's the price we pay for the freedom to be our true selves. And here's the thing. Freedom of speech isn't just about protecting speech you agree with. That's easy. It's about standing up for speech that challenges you, that makes you uncomfortable, that tests your tolerance. Because if we can't protect the speech we disagree with, then freedom of speech doesn't mean anything. It becomes a hollow shell, something we pay lip service to without actually living it. And that's not what America is about. America is about being bold enough, brave enough to handle the full spectrum of ideas, the full range of human thought. It's about trusting people to hear things and decide for themselves what they believe, what they value, what they stand for. So let's not be afraid. Let's not be afraid of ideas, of conversations, of challenges. Let's not be afraid to live fully in our freedom with all the messiness and complexity that comes with it, because that's where the magic happens. That's where we find ourselves. That's where we connect, where we learn, where we grow. And if we protect that, if we nurture it, if we defend it with everything we've got, then freedom of speech will continue to be the heartbeat of this country. It'll continue to be that thing that drives us forward, that pushes us to be better, that keeps us moving toward that ideal of a free, open, and just society. So my challenge to you, to all of us, is this. Let's be defenders of freedom. Not just in theory, but in practice. Let's be the ones who stand up, who speak out, who speak out, who refuse to let fear dictate our lives. Let's be the generation that keeps freedom of speech alive, that keeps the spirit of open dialogue burning bright, that passes on to the next generation a society that values every voice, every perspective, every person's right to be heard. Because if we do that, if we make that commitment right here, right now, then freedom of speech won't just survive. It'll thrive. And that's the legacy I want to be a part of. That's the legacy I think we can all be proud of. So let's do this. Let's live it. Let's protect it. Let's make sure freedom of speech remains not just a right, but a way of life for all of us. Forever. All right, here we are at the end. And if there's one thing I want you to walk away with, it's this. Freedom of speech is not just a right. It's a responsibility. It's a commitment to being honest, to being brave, to being willing to speak your truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And it's a commitment to protect that right for others, especially when we don't agree with them. It's easy to defend speech that aligns with what we believe, but true freedom of speech, the kind of freedom this country was built on, is about standing up for voices that challenge us, that push us, that make us question our own perspectives, because that's how we grow. That's how we evolve. And that's how we keep this society, this experiment in freedom, alive. You know, we talk a lot about the things that divide us in this country. Mm-hmm. But the truth is there's something that unites us all, something that's woven into the DNA of America, and that's this commitment to individual liberty, to personal freedom. Freedom of speech is right there at the core of that. It's the engine that drives us forward, that lets us share ideas, that opens us up to new ways of thinking, that makes us stronger. And every single one of us has a part to play in protecting that freedom. It's not just up to the government or the courts or the media. It's up to us, to every individual who believes in the power of truth, of honesty, of open dialogue. Think about it. What kind of world do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a place where people are silenced, where ideas are stifled, where everyone is afraid to speak up? Or do you want to live in a place that celebrates diversity of thought, that welcomes debate, that respects every individual's right to be heard? I know what I want. I want to live in a world where people are free to be themselves, to express what they believe, to engage in real, meaningful conversations. Because that's what makes us human. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us American. And that's what will keep us moving forward, no matter what challenges we face. So here's my call to action. Don't take this freedom for granted. Use it. Stand up for it. Every time you speak your mind, every time you allow someone else the space to speak theirs, you're making a difference. You're keeping that spirit of freedom alive. And it doesn't matter if it's a big conversation or a small one. Every time we choose to engage openly and honestly, we're contributing to something bigger than ourselves. We're building a society that values truth, that respects differences, that thrives on diversity of thought. And in a world that sometimes feels like it's getting darker, more divided, more closed off, that's something incredibly powerful. So let's make that choice. Let's be the people who live boldly, who speak honestly, who listen deeply. Let's be the ones who protect freedom of speech, not just because it's in the Constitution, but because it's in our hearts, in our minds, in our very souls. Because this freedom isn't just a gift from those who came before us. It's a responsibility we carry for those who come after. And I truly believe that if we keep that in mind, if we remember that we're all a part of this incredible experiment in freedom, then we'll find a way to keep this country, this beautiful, messy, complicated country, moving forward one voice at a time, one conversation at a time, one courageous choice at a time. So let's do it. Let's keep the flame of freedom burning bright. For ourselves, for each other, and for the future we're all creating together.